quite a few bottles.
Yeah, well, big range of whiskies. So,
welcome again to brandylibrary.tv for the Brand Ambassador series. We're going to Ireland. John Cashman.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for
nice having you here.
Yeah, absolute pleasure to be here. And it's good to get the opportunity to talk about Cooley whiskey and some of our brands.
Well, this is great that you're here because I have the feeling that our consumers don't know how good Irish whiskey can be.
It is widely accepted at this stage that we did invent whiskey. The first whiskey produced.
I love the way you just put it.
Yeah,
just like that.
Just straight out from
right
off the bat. Yeah, off the bat.
Okay.
Get it over and done
and
with.
I thought the French invented just about everything.
No, not whiskey. Not whiskey, I'm afraid.
I'll give you that.
But we didn't invent distillation. I'm not going to claim that one. And as we know, distillation was occurring in the Middle East, in Egypt, in Moorish Spain. And more than likely it was Irish monks, when they were travelling around in the 7th to 8th, 9th centuries, spreading the word of God. They would have picked up different ideas and brought some of them back with them to Ireland. And one of those was the art of distillation. So they brought that idea back with them to Ireland. And Ireland at that stage, it was all revolving around the monasteries. They were like monastic settlements and cities. So the monks were the educators, they were distillers, they were brewers, they were farmers. They did everything, and people flocked to them to get the children educated and for security reasons. But they started distilling. And the idea of distillation, obviously, is a relatively simple idea. It's the separation of alcohol from water, of a mixture of the two, boil it up, alcohol comes off, leaving water behind. In the, we'd say, Moorish Spain and in the Arab world, it was medicinal, purely medicinal, or as a base for perfumes, as it still is today. And even the word alcohol, we know now, originated in the Arabic language, from alcohol. So the monks were producing this spirit. They had to give it a name. So in the Irish language, the Gaelic language, which they spoke at the time, they called it Uisce Beatha, the water of life. Uisce is the Irish word for water and Beatha, life. And it's simple to see how it got that name, because it is still spirit we all know is a colourless liquid. But when it was given to an ill person, a person who had maybe food poisoning, had an upset stomach, there was no Alka-Seltzers, there was no Tums, there was no antibiotics, they were given alcohol, and alcohol settled their stomach. So for all intensive purposes, it was the water that gave life. When the Normans first came to Ireland, this is where you French guys come into it, when the Normans first came to Ireland in the 12th century, they integrated themselves into Irish community, married Irish women, their kids were brought up as Irish speaking Gaelic, but they couldn't speak Gaelic. They could drink Uisce Beatha, but they had a problem to pronounce it correctly. So if you take the word Uisce, the Irish word for water, and to spell it, it's spelled U-I-S-C-E. And if you don't know how to pronounce that correctly and you try to pronounce it phonetically, you pronounce it Iski. U-I-S-C-E, Iski. So they started consuming and looking for Iski. And as the English language evolved from this early Anglo-Norman language, Iski became Fwisky with an F, and in the modern word whiskey. So you can see even the word has its origins in the Irish language. Now, for my Scotch friends out there, there was always trade between Ireland and Scotland, and the northeastern tip of Ireland and the southwestern tip of Scotland is only 12, 18, about 16 to 18 miles apart. And even from prehistoric times, from mythology, there was always giants coming from one area to the other, but more importantly, there was trade. And if you travel from that northeastern tip of Ireland to the southwestern tip of Scotland, the first island you come across is an island called Iona. It was founded by an Irish monk in the 8th or 9th century. And more than likely, having left Ireland, he brought everything that he would have done in Ireland with him. More than likely, that would have been distillation as well. And from there, distillation would have moved throughout all the rest of Scotland. And I'm absolutely, there's no doubt in my mind, the Isle of Islay is in that region. It's the most vibrant whiskey producing area in Scotland, probably, and hence, closest to Ireland. Right. So there is no doubt that it did travel over, but, I always say to people as well, there are three things that we Irish invented that the Scots have taken ownership of. One is whiskey, one is kilts, and one is bagpipes. But, we just never told the Scots that two of them were jokes, They took out all of them seriously, unfortunately. But look, from that period on, Irish whiskey became very popular. We know Queen Elizabeth I, it was her preferred drink. It became the drink of her royal court. Anyone who was in her presence, she would ensure that it was Irish whiskey that was provided, not mead, not cider, not beer, not wine, Irish whiskey. Tsar Peter the Great, the Tsar who unified all of Russia, he said in his actual quotation, "Of all the wines of the world, the Irish spirit is the best." Dr. Samuel Johnson, when he wrote the first ever dictionary of the English language in the 17th century, he had an entry in it for Irish whiskey. And he described it as a distilled spirit from Ireland, more flavoursome, but not as firesome as its Scotch counterpart. Which is very interesting. Firstly, because Irish whiskey is in the first dictionary. But secondly, they were seen as a distinction between Irish and Scotch. And by implication, Irish whiskey was seen as a superior product.
Right.
You know, by the 1880s, Irish whiskey became the most popular brown spirit in the world, because the only drink that was more popular was, of course, brandy or cognac. Then you had phylloxera, which destroyed the grape harvests of France. Without the vineyards, there was no cognac. So the royal courts of Europe, the wealthy people throughout the world, when they couldn't get their hand on cognac, they turned to Irish whiskey. It was seen as popular, not as popular, I mean, it was seen as good a quality as the finest of cognac. So that was the last great heyday for Irish whiskey, was around the 1880s and 1890s.
Up until now.
Up until now. Now, you know, I always say there are three golden ages of Irish whiskey. There was when we invented it, there was when we dominated the world, and then there's today, when we're the fastest growing spirit again.
Right.
But the problem is, in order to be the fastest growing spirit, that means something has had to happen in between. And unfortunately, Irish whiskey was on its knees 20 years ago. Absolutely on its knees.
And nowadays it's very few distilleries.
Today there are only 4 distilleries in Ireland.
Making a whole range of different products. Though.
Yeah, we control 2 of those distilleries. We have our main plant is Cooley in County Louth, which is approximately 40 miles north of Dublin on the east coast. And our second plant, which is now fully operational, is the Kilbeggan distillery in County Westmeath, which is the oldest licensed whiskey distillery in the world.
You're controlling quite a bit of the Irish whiskey production.
Yeah, yeah.
I see 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 bottles, yet you're producing even more.
Yes.
Can we put a style on Irish whiskey already, or are there several styles?
There are many different styles to Irish whiskey. Now, up until our foundation, it would have been thought that Irish whiskey was just one particular style. And that was determined by the surviving distilleries. You've got to remember, in the heyday there were over 80 legal distilleries. There were, even prior to that, there were probably 2,000 distilleries, but you know, most of them were illegal. But it went from 80 to the end of World War II, there were only 6. And within 10 years after World War II, there were only 4. Then those 4 came together, closed down 3 of the plants, opened a brand new plant in Middleton, County Cork, and kept the second plant in Bushmills, County Antrim. So from the 1970s until our foundation in '87, there was only one company controlling Irish whiskey. And then by 1987, that company became French when Pernod Ricard bought Irish distillers. Firstly, there was no law in Ireland saying how many times you should distill a whiskey. There was no law in the Whiskey Act saying it has to be triple distilled. You go through Barnard's book when he was travelling through Great Britain and Ireland in the 1880s, visiting every single distillery. What a job that would have been. You know, every single distillery. There's constant records of distilling in Ireland being double distilled primarily. Majority of distilleries were double distilling. Okay, Jameson was double distilling in the 1880s. Bushmills was double distilling in the 1880s. You know, and it's documented in Barnard's book. Ireland, the land mass of Ireland, is 1/6 peat. That is our landmass. It is our natural resource. And then people have grown up thinking, oh, you don't use peat in Ireland. Well, of course we did. We used it in firing the kilns, drying the barley, the workers would dry their clothes over it, everything, you know. And Irish whiskey traditionally was peated. So when we were founded in '87, we wanted to bring back these lost traditions of Irish distilling, but not only that, but to show the world that Irish whiskey was as diverse as the different regions in Scotland, but could be as diverse from just one distillery.
Right.
And that's what we set out to do. So today in Cooley, we produce, at the moment, 4 distinct styles of whiskey. We've just produced a 5th style, which I will mention briefly, but the 4 styles of whiskey that we make are single grain whiskey, we make blended whiskey, we make single malt whiskey, and we make peated malt whiskey. Now in the past year, we've also started doing that traditional Irish single pot still or pure pot still whiskey. So we've started producing that now. And that won't be available for a few years. But we have started producing it, so Middleton don't have all that to themselves anymore. We're also now producing poitín as well. But the poaching we're making is from our single pot still.
Will that be drinkable though?
Oh, it's delicious. It's delicious. 65.
Poaching can be.
It can be. It can drive you mad. It can turn you blind if you get a bad one. But this is good poaching. Malted barley, unmalted barley, triple distilled. First time we've ever triple distilled in the copper pot stills, and coming out at 65% alcohol.
Oh.
Absolute delicious. You wouldn't know it's 65%. It is so soft, so fresh, very easy to drink. Now, I wouldn't drink a bottle in one sitting,
right?
But we just want to show, look, that's the real traditional, that more than likely was real Irish whiskey 200 years ago, before maturation really came into its own. So we're just bringing that tradition back, taking ownership again.
If we talk about the grain itself, when you say that you're making grain whiskey, what's the grain?
Okay.
Where is it coming from?
Yeah.
Do you process that yourself? Tell me more about it.
The grain that we use for our single grain whiskey is non-GM French summer corn. People often say, well, why don't you use Irish corn? Well, they're people who've obviously never been to Ireland. We don't have the climate for proper corn production in Ireland. Now, again, an argument that has come my way is, does that not mean like you're using a foreign grain? You know, that wouldn't be traditional. Well, again, in Barnard's book in the 1880s, as he's going around, he's seeing corn being used in different distilleries in Ireland. Now, where did they get that? More than likely from France, because France and Ireland traditionally were always great trading partners, you know? So more than likely it was always French corn being used. So for our single grain whiskey, we use 93% corn. We use 7% malted barley. The malted barley is only in it to help the fermentation process. It doesn't affect the flavour, you can't taste it at all. The important part is to get the flavour of the corn out of it. It is then distilled in the column stills rather than the pot stills.
And there's no wheat?
No wheat in our grain mix, no. So it's corn and malted barley, that is it. Traditionally, any grain whiskey was only used for blending. We found at a very early stage that our grain whiskey was so full of flavour, it'd be a shame just to hide it in the blend. So we decided to release it in its own right. And that's what we did.
That's your green ore.
With green ore.
And it's lovely and actually quite rare.
It is, yeah.
In Europe, it's not single grain really, because you've got some malted barley in there, but aged corn doesn't come that civilized.
No. It's I mean, some of the leading whiskey writers look at Jim Murray. Jim Murray regularly says Cooley has probably the best grain distillery in the world, you know. So we decided what we would do with this is we would age it for 8 years in first fill bourbon barrels. So
you're using a column still then?
Yes, we are for this.
How is that column still different from other column stills?
There's a lot of copper on the inside of it, and we believe that that is the reason why our whiskey is so full of flavour. Our column still looks the same as any other. You know, it's 3 stories tall. It's about 5 feet wide. You know.
What do you do with the barrels when you're done with this maturation?
We will use them again. We will use our barrels up to 3 times. So second time might be for we might put malt whiskey into it. You know, and then by the 3rd use, we'll reassess, and if we feel we're getting no more out of it, well, then we'll sell them off.